They thought they had just thrown out an ordinary woman, but in less than 5 minutes, they would realize they had just humiliated the wrong person at the worst possible place. The golden lights of the restaurant reflected off polished marble floors as Olivia Bennet stepped inside. Her soft beige dress simple, her flats slightly worn, nothing about her appearance matching the tailored suits and designer gowns that filled the room. Yet her posture remained steady, her eyes calm, as if she had walked into places like this 1,000 times before. Conversations hummed quietly, glasses clinked, and a pianist in the corner played something slow and expensive, the kind of music meant to remind everyone exactly where they were and who belonged. Olivia paused just for a second, taking in the room, not with awe, but with quiet observation, the kind that missed nothing. The hostess behind the podium glanced up, her smile practiced but fleeting, eyes scanning Olivia from head to toe in less than a second, the assessment quick, decisive, and dismissive. "Reservation?" she asked, already half turning away. Assuming the answer, Olivia gave a small nod, her voice calm, almost too calm for someone standing alone in a place like this. "I'm meeting someone," she said, but the hostess didn't respond right away, instead glancing toward a man in a navy suit nearby, the floor manager, who had already noticed the subtle disruption, his expression tightening as he approached, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the marble. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided there was. The hostess leaned slightly toward him, whispering just loud enough for Olivia to hear fragments. "No reservation, not dressed." The manager's gaze shifted to Olivia, slower this time, more deliberate, his lips pressing into a thin line that looked almost like a smile, but carried no warmth. "Ma'am," he began, voice smooth but edged with something colder. "This is a private dining establishment. We do require confirmed reservations." Olivia met his eyes without flinching. "I understand. I'm waiting for my husband," she replied softly, but the manager's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened, as if her calmness irritated him more than any argument could have. Around them, a few nearby guests had begun to notice, subtle glances turning into open curiosity. A woman in a red dress leaned toward her companion, whispering behind a raised hand. A man near the bar smirked into his drink. The shift in the room was small, but unmistakable, attention gathering like a quiet storm. The manager stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to avoid being heard. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside," he said, the words polite on the surface but firm underneath, final, as if there was no version of reality where she belonged inside. Olivia didn't move right away, not out of defiance, but because for a brief moment, the room seemed to pause with her, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, and then she gave a small nod, almost as if she had expected this. "That's fine," she said quietly, turning toward the door without another word, the silence behind her stretching just a second too long, as if the room itself was waiting for something it didn't yet understand. And just beyond the glass entrance, far down the street, the low, unmistakable growl of an engine began to echo closer. Olivia stepped out onto the sidewalk as the heavy glass door closed behind her with a quiet finality. The warmth and polished elegance of the restaurant instantly replaced by the cool evening air, yet her expression did not change, not even slightly, as if this moment had already played out in her mind long before it ever happened. Inside, the murmur of conversation slowly resumed, though not quite at its original ease. A few guests still glancing toward the entrance, curiosity lingering in their eyes, while the manager adjusted his cufflinks and exhaled, satisfied that the situation had been handled, that order had been restored, that everything was once again as it should be. Outside, Olivia moved a few steps away from the entrance, standing near the curb beneath the soft glow of a street lamp, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture relaxed, almost patient, as if she was not waiting to be let back in, but waiting for something else entirely, something inevitable. The distant sound of the engine grew louder now, no longer a faint vibration but a presence, smooth and controlled, the kind of sound that turned heads without needing to demand attention, a deep, confident hum that did not rush, did not hesitate. It simply approached. A valet near the entrance shifted his stance, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked down the street. Recognition flickering before understanding fully formed. Another staff member followed his gaze, then another, until the subtle shift in attention began to ripple outward like a quiet signal passing through the air. Inside, one of the diners paused mid-sentence, glancing toward the window as the reflection of headlights stretched across the polished floor, cutting through the warm ambient lighting with a sharp, unmistakable contrast. The pianist faltered for half a second before continuing, though now softer, uncertain, as if even the music sensed the change. The manager turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the growing distraction, his expression tightening again, irritation replacing confidence. He stepped toward the entrance, ready to address whatever inconvenience was unfolding, still unaware that this moment was no longer under his control. Outside, the car came into view, sleek and precise, its dark finish catching the streetlights in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It did not stop abruptly. It glided to the curb with quiet authority, as if it belonged there more than anyone inside the building. The valet straightened immediately, his earlier indifference gone, replaced by alert attention, the kind reserved for only a very specific kind of arrival. Olivia did not move, did not turn. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, as the engine softened into silence and the driver's side door opened with measured ease. A man stepped out, tall, composed, his suit perfectly tailored, not loud, not flashy, but unmistakably precise in every detail, the kind of presence that did not need introduction. It simply demanded recognition. The valet took a step forward, then stopped, as if something about the moment told him to wait. Inside, the manager reached the doorway just as the man closed the car door, his eyes lifting, scanning the entrance, then settling, immediately, on Olivia. And in that instant, something shifted, not in the air, but in the balance of the entire scene, because the look that crossed his face was not surprise, not confusion, but quiet certainty, as if he had found exactly who he had come for. And the realization had already begun to spread, slow and unstoppable, through everyone who was watching. The moment his eyes found Olivia, everything else seemed to fall away, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet precision that made it even more powerful, as if the world had simply corrected itself. He moved toward her without hesitation, each step measured, controlled, the kind of movement that carried weight without needing to rush. And when he reached her, his expression softened in a way that no one inside had seen before. "I am sorry I am late," he said, his voice calm, steady yet carrying an authority that reached beyond the sidewalk and into the restaurant behind them. Olivia gave a small, almost knowing smile, the kind that revealed nothing and everything at once. "It is fine," she replied, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had not just been asked to leave moments ago. Behind the glass doors, the manager had stopped mid-step, his hand still on the handle, his earlier confidence slipping into something far less certain, because now he recognized the man, standing outside, not from personal introduction, but from reputation, from articles, from conversations that circulated in rooms far more exclusive than this one, a name that carried influence without needing explanation. A murmur began to spread among the staff, quiet at first, then growing as realization passed from one to another. The valet straightened even further, his posture now rigid with awareness, while a hostess glanced nervously toward the manager, waiting for direction that did not come. The man turned slightly, his gaze shifting from Olivia to the entrance, not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate, and in that single glance, the dynamic of the entire evening began to change. Because this was no longer about a misunderstanding, it was about recognition, about who had been seen and who had not. He extended his hand gently toward Olivia, not as a display, but as something natural, expected, and she placed her hand in his without hesitation, their movement synchronized in a way that spoke of familiarity, of partnership, of a shared understanding that required no explanation. Together, they stepped toward the entrance, the glass door opening before they even reached it. The manager now standing aside, his earlier firmness replaced by a tension he could no longer hide. "Sir," he began, his voice catching slightly before he corrected it. There may have been a misunderstanding, but the words sounded smaller than he intended, thinner, as if they had already lost their weight before reaching the air. The man paused just inside the doorway, not fully entering, not fully stopping, his eyes meeting the manager's with a calm that was far more unsettling than anger. "She was here," he said quietly, each word measured, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. "You just chose not to see her." And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire room suspended in a silence that felt heavier than any raised voice, the kind of silence that forced reflection whether anyone wanted it or not. A glass clinked softly somewhere in the background, a chair shifted, but the usual rhythm of the restaurant had been broken, replaced by something far more revealing. Because now every person watching understood exactly what had happened, and more importantly, what it meant. Olivia did not look at the manager, did not seek acknowledgement or apology. She simply stood beside her husband, composed, unaffected, as if the judgment she had faced minutes earlier no longer held any power at all, because the truth had already revealed itself, not through confrontation, but through presence. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, the room learned something it would not easily forget. The manager's mouth opened slightly as if searching for the right words, but none seemed to come, because in that moment he understood that this was no longer a situation he could control. With polished phrases or rehearsed policies, the balance had shifted too far, too fast. Around him, the staff stood unusually still, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet unease, the kind that spreads when a mistake is no longer small enough to ignore, and the guests, once absorbed in their meals and conversations, now watched openly, their curiosity no longer hidden, their expressions carrying a mix of realization and silent judgment. The man beside Olivia did not raise his voice, did not step closer, did not need to, because his presence alone had already filled the space. And when he finally spoke again, it was not directed at the manager alone, but at the entire room. "We had a reservation," he said calmly, his tone even, as if stating a simple fact, yet the weight behind it pressed heavily against the polished walls and carefully maintained atmosphere. The manager blinked, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath. I was not informed," he replied, though the words sounded hollow even to himself. A hostess quickly shuffled through the reservation list, her hands moving faster than before, her breath shallow, and within seconds, her eyes widened slightly, confirming what should have been obvious from the start. "It is here," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the room, it carried clearly. The manager's face shifted again, this time not just uncertain, but exposed. Because the truth had now been spoken aloud, undeniable, irreversible. Olivia remained still, her gaze soft but unwavering, not looking for apology, not demanding acknowledgement, simply present in a way that made everything else feel unnecessary. And that quiet composure unsettled the manager more than any confrontation could have. "Please," he said finally, stepping aside more fully now, his posture no longer authoritative but accommodating. "Your table is ready." But the words came too late. Stripped of the confidence they might have carried before, reduced to an attempt to repair something that had already been broken. The man glanced at Olivia briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, not of anger, but of understanding. And then he turned back toward the manager, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. "It was ready earlier too," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation, one that landed heavier than any raised voice ever could. A subtle shift moved through the room again, this time not curiosity, but recognition, as if everyone present had just witnessed something they would remember long after the evening ended, not because of what was said, but because of what had been revealed. The pianist, who had slowed unconsciously, now stopped entirely for a brief second before resuming with a softer melody, as if even the music had adjusted to the new reality. The manager stepped back further, creating space, not just physically, but symbolically, his earlier authority replaced by a quiet submission to a truth he could no longer deny. Olivia and her husband moved forward together, not hurried, not hesitant, simply continuing as if this had always been the natural course of the evening. And as they passed deeper into the restaurant, the room remained silent, not out of obligation, but because something had shifted in a way that words could not easily restore. And in that silence, the lesson settled in, clear and undeniable, without ever needing to be spoken aloud. They were seated at a table near the center of the room, one of the best in the restaurant, though neither Olivia nor her husband reacted to it as if it were a privilege. Instead, they settled in with the same quiet composure they had carried from the moment they arrived, as if the setting had never defined their place within it. A server approached cautiously, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful attentiveness, placing menus down with steady hands, her voice softer than before as she explained the specials. But Olivia simply thanked her with a gentle nod, her tone unchanged, free of resentment, free of superiority, as though nothing needed to be proven. Across the room, the manager remained standing near the entrance longer than necessary, watching, not out of authority now, but out of something closer to reflection, his posture less rigid, his movement slower, as if each second forced him to reconsider the decisions he had made just minutes earlier. Conversations gradually returned, but not fully, not completely, because the atmosphere had shifted in a way that lingered beneath every word, every glance, every quiet pause between bites of carefully prepared meals. A couple seated nearby exchanged looks, their earlier amusement replaced by a subtle discomfort, the kind that comes from recognizing a truth too late, while another guest lowered his gaze, suddenly more interested in his plate than the scene he had witnessed unfold. Olivia glanced around the room briefly, not searching for validation, not acknowledging the attention, simply observing, the same way she had when she first walked in, her eyes calm, thoughtful, as if she understood that what had happened was never really about her alone, but about something larger, something that revealed itself in moments like these. Her husband leaned slightly forward, his voice low, meant only for her, though the steadiness in his tone carried a quiet certainty. "Are you all right?" he asked, not out of doubt, but out of care, and Olivia gave a small smile, the kind that did not need explanation. "I have been better," she replied softly, then after a brief pause. "But I have also been worse," and there was no bitterness in her voice, only perspective. He studied her for a moment, then nodded, understanding more than her words alone could convey, because this was not the first time she had faced judgment, and it would not be the last. But what mattered was not the moment itself. It was how it ended, and how it was carried forward. The manager finally approached the table, slower this time, without the polished confidence he had worn earlier, his hands held together in front of him, his expression careful, measured, as if each word had to be chosen with precision. "Ma'am, sir," he began, his voice quieter than before. "I would like to apologize for earlier." And the room, though no longer silent, seemed to listen again, the weight of the moment returning without needing to be announced. Olivia looked up at him, her expression unchanged, not cold, not forgiving, simply present, and for a second, the manager hesitated, as if unsure how to continue, because the apology itself felt insufficient against what had already been revealed. Her husband did not interrupt, did not speak for her. He simply remained still, allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms. Olivia nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then returned her attention to the menu in front of her, not dismissing the apology, but not elevating it either. And in that simple gesture, the final balance settled, not with confrontation, not with punishment, but with a quiet understanding that respect, once denied, could not be restored with words alone. The manager stood there for a moment longer, then stepped back, the realization clear in his eyes, and as he walked away, the room did not react with applause or whispers. It simply continued, but differently now, because something had been seen, something that could not be unseen. And as the soft music filled the space once more, the lesson remained, not spoken, but felt by everyone who had been there to witness it. The evening continued, but not in the same way it had begun, because something invisible had shifted beneath the polished surface of the restaurant, something that no amount of candlelight or soft music could fully conceal. And as plates were served and glasses refilled, the awareness lingered, subtle but undeniable, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. Olivia moved through the evening with the same calm presence she had carried from the start, speaking gently with the server, thanking her, without hesitation, never allowing the earlier moment to define her behavior. and that quiet consistency made a deeper impression than any display of anger ever could. Her husband watched her occasionally, not with concern now, but with a quiet respect, as if he understood that her strength had never required defense. It simply existed, steady and unshaken, regardless of who chose to recognize it. Across the room, the manager continued his duties, but there was a noticeable difference in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at each guest who entered, no longer scanning for status or appearance, but pausing just a second longer, as if reconsidering the assumptions that had once come so easily. And each time the door opened, there was a brief moment where he seemed to remember, to adjust, to choose differently. A new couple entered, casually dressed, uncertain, and for a split second, the old instinct flickered in his expression, but it faded just as quickly, replaced by something more measured, more aware, as he stepped forward with a genuine greeting, his tone respectful, his posture open, and those watching closely could see that the lesson had already begun to take shape, not through punishment, but through realization. At Olivia's table, conversation flowed quietly, not centered on what had happened, but on ordinary things, shared plans, small details of life that mattered far more than the fleeting judgment of strangers. And yet beneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that moments like this carried weight beyond the immediate, that they revealed truths people often preferred not to see. As the meal came to a close, the atmosphere of the restaurant had settled into something calmer, more reflective. The earlier tension dissolved, but not forgotten, and when Olivia stood to leave, there was no announcement, no attention drawn to her departure, but a few subtle glances followed her, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to respect. The manager stepped forward once more, not blocking her path, not correcting anything, simply opening the door with a quiet nod, a gesture small in action but significant in meaning, and Olivia returned it with the same gentle acknowledgement she had given before, nothing more, nothing less. Outside, the night air felt different, not because it had changed, but because the moment had passed, and as they walked toward the car, her husband glanced at her briefly. "You handled that better than most would," he said, his voice low, thoughtful, and Olivia gave a faint smile, her eyes steady. "People show you who they are," she replied softly. "You just have to decide what you will carry with you." And as the car door closed and the engine came to life once more, the restaurant behind them returned to its rhythm, but not entirely. Unchanged, because inside those walls, something had been learned, not spoken, not written, but felt deeply enough to remain, long after the night had ended. And in that quiet understanding, the true measure of dignity revealed itself, not in how one is treated, but in how one chooses to respond. The car moved smoothly through the quiet streets, the glow of the restaurant fading behind them. But the moment they had just lived through did not disappear so easily. It lingered in the silence between them, not heavy, not uncomfortable, but present, like a thought waiting to be understood. Olivia rested her hand lightly against the window, watching the city lights pass by in soft reflections, her expression calm, yet thoughtful, as if she was revisiting something deeper than the surface of what had happened. While beside her, her husband kept his focus on the road, though his mind was clearly elsewhere, turning over the same quiet realization that had begun forming the moment he stepped out of the car. "It happens more often than people admit," he said after a while, his voice steady, not frustrated, not surprised, just aware. Olivia nodded slightly, her gaze still on the passing lights. "It always has," she replied, her tone gentle, not cynical, but grounded in experience. And for a moment, neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing more that needed to be said about the situation itself, only what it revealed. The car turned onto a quieter street, lined with tall trees and soft shadows, the kind of place where the noise of the city felt distant, almost unreal, and Olivia shifted her posture slightly, turning back toward him. "You know," she said softly. "They were not trying to be cruel." He glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. "No," he agreed. "They thought they were being correct." And that distinction settled between them, quiet but significant, because it spoke to something deeper than a single moment, something rooted in assumptions, in habits, in the way people learn to measure others without ever realizing it. Olivia smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with understanding. That is why it matters, she said, her voice calm. Because when people believe they are right, they do not question themselves. And her words carried a quiet weight, not accusatory, but reflective, as if she was speaking not just about the restaurant, but about a pattern she had seen many times before. He nodded slowly, his grip on the steering wheel relaxed. And yet you did not correct them, he said, not as a challenge, but as an observation. Olivia let out a soft breath, her eyes lowering for a moment before lifting again, steady as always. I did not need to, she answered, and there was no pride in her voice, only clarity. They corrected themselves, and as she spoke, the meaning of that settled into the space between them, because the moment had never been about proving anything. It had been about revealing something that was already there. The car came to a gentle stop at a red light, the glow reflecting across the dashboard, and for a second, everything felt still, suspended, as if even time had paused to listen, and then the light changed, the engine carried them forward again, and the city resumed its quiet rhythm around them. Behind them, miles away, the restaurant continued its evening. But for those who had been there, the memory would not fade easily, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood, and in that understanding, something small but lasting had shifted, a reminder that dignity was not something granted by others, but something carried within, steady and unshaken, waiting only for the world to notice. The city grew quieter as they drove farther from the center, the glow of storefronts giving way to softer residential lights. And for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was tension, but because the silence itself felt complete, carrying everything that needed to be understood without forcing it into words. Olivia leaned back slightly, her gaze no longer fixed on the window, but somewhere deeper, reflective, as if the evening had stirred memories she had long since learned to carry. Without weight, and after a few moments she spoke again, her voice calm, almost distant. The first time it happened, I thought I had done something wrong, and the words lingered in the car, quiet but revealing. Her husband glanced at her briefly, his expression softening, not out of surprise, but recognition, as if he had always known there was more behind her calm than she ever chose to explain. And now, he asked gently, not pressing, simply inviting her to continue. Olivia let out a small breath, her fingers resting loosely in her lap. Now I know it is not about me, she said, her tone steady, grounded in something that had been tested over time. It is about what people expect to see. And as she spoke, the meaning settled with quiet clarity, because what had unfolded at the restaurant was not an isolated moment. It was part of a pattern that repeated itself in different places, with different faces, but always the same underlying assumption. The car slowed as they approached a familiar street, the trees arching overhead casting soft shadows across the pavement, and her husband nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Expectations are easy, he said after a moment. They save people from having to think. And there was no bitterness in his voice, only observation, the kind that came from understanding how the world often worked beneath its surface. Olivia smiled faintly, not because it was amusing, but because it was true. And when something does not match those expectations, she continued, they do not question the expectation, they question the person. And her words carried a quiet precision, not sharp, but undeniable, as if they had been shaped by experience rather than theory. The car turned into the driveway, the engine slowing to a gentle idle before coming to a stop, and for a second neither of them moved, the stillness returning once more, but now it felt different, more resolved, as if the evening had reached its natural conclusion. Her husband rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment longer, then turned slightly toward her. Do you ever get tired of it? He asked, not out of doubt, but out of care. And Olivia considered the question, her eyes thoughtful, her expression unchanged. No, she answered quietly. Because every time it happens, it shows me something. And there was a quiet strength in her voice, not defiant, not defensive, but certain. It shows me who people are before they realize anyone is watching. And that understanding carried a weight far greater than any apology or recognition could offer. She reached for the door handle, pausing for just a second as if marking the end of the moment, then stepped out into the calm night air, the world around them still, unchanged, yet subtly different in the way it felt. Because what had happened was not just an event, it was a reminder. One that did not need to be repeated aloud to be understood. And as they walked toward the house together, side by side, the lesson followed quietly behind them, not as something heavy, but as something steady, something that would remain long after the details of the night had faded, a simple truth carried forward without effort, waiting for the next moment when it would be seen again. The house was quiet when they stepped inside, the soft click of the door closing behind them marking the true end of the evening, not with noise or finality, but with a calm sense of completion, as if everything that needed to happen had already unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Olivia set her keys gently on the table, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the air around her. Not heavier, not lighter, just settled, like a story that had reached its natural conclusion without needing to announce it. Her husband loosened his jacket slightly, glancing at her for a moment, as if considering whether to say something more, but then choosing not to, because he understood that the meaning of the night had already been fully realized, not in words, but in what had been quietly revealed. Olivia walked toward the window, looking out into the stillness of the neighborhood, the streetlights casting soft reflections across the glass, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to pause, not to relive what had happened, but to acknowledge it, the way one acknowledges something familiar, something expected, something that no longer had the power to unsettle, only to remind. Behind her, the room remained silent, but it was not empty. It held the presence of understanding, the kind that does not demand attention but stays nonetheless, shaping the way things are seen moving forward. Her husband stepped closer, not interrupting her thoughts, just standing beside her, sharing the same quiet view. And after a moment, he spoke, his voice low, steady. "They will remember tonight." And Olivia nodded slightly, her eyes still on the reflection before her. "Maybe," she said softly, "but not for the reason they think." And there was something in her tone that carried both certainty and peace, as if she knew that the lesson was never about embarrassment or correction, but about something deeper, something that would surface again in ways they might not even notice at first. She turned away from the window then, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, as if she had already moved beyond the moment while others were still trying to understand it. And as she walked further into the house, there was no sense of victory, no trace of resentment, only a quiet continuation of life exactly as it was before, because nothing about her worth had changed. It had simply been revealed to those who had failed to see it. Outside, the night remained still, the world unchanged in its appearance. Yet somewhere, in the minds of those who had witnessed the evening unfold, something subtle had shifted, a hesitation before judgment, a pause before assumption, a fleeting awareness that might one day grow into something more. And in that quiet, unseen transformation, the true impact of the moment settled, not in the restaurant, not in the apology, not even in the recognition, but in the understanding that dignity does not arrive with wealth, status, or validation. It exists long before those things are ever noticed, waiting patiently, silently, until the world is ready to see it. And on that night, for just a brief moment, it had been seen clearly enough to leave a mark that would not easily fade.